recorded. My name is Tarun Khaitan. I'm going to go through some of the broad things that, as an assessor, I look at, and I think most assessors look at, in what makes a good essay. Having said that, everything I say today is subject to whatever your course tutors tell you. Right? If there's a conflict, listen to your tutors. Right? These are general guidelines, and they must give way to anything more specific. All right. Hopefully, after the presentation, there'll be time for some Q&A. So let's see how this goes. Right. Now, the first thing I want you to know who your audience is, right? And I've been marking essays for a very long time. Academics tend not to like marking essays, and this is no disrespect to you, but it is usually something that you have to do in a very short time. The turnaround time is a week or two, and the number of essays you have to mark can be quite high. Each academic may be marking anything between 40 to 60 essays, often on the same topic. And we're all overworked. So the person you're trying to write for, just bear in mind, is an expert in your subject, is overworked, probably quite tired, and may well come to your script on a Friday evening on their fifth cup of coffee, right? So that is the person you're trying to impress. And they have probably already read 30 essay answers, which pretty much say the same thing, right? So how do you communicate with that person and make them wake up slightly and sit up? So that's your target audience. And everybody hates marking because it's, no, I shouldn't say everybody, most people hate marking. Again, no disrespect, right? But it's a difficult job. It's a tiring job. You don't have any publication at the end of it. And unlike teaching, it's not interactive with the students. So really think about this being your audience. Please come in. Are there more people coming on their way? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. So, with this person in mind, ask yourself, how can you write an essay that is not only excellent, but also kind to this person? It might be a weird thing to think about, right? But making your reader's task easy is one of the keys to writing a good essay. And I'll show you in this hour how you might be able to do that, or various ways of being kind to your reader. But the first thing, the most important thing you need to know about an essay is that an essay is an argument or a series of arguments. An essay has to be argumentative. Right? What does it mean? What is an argument? How do you know whether you've written an argument or not? There are two questions to ask yourself. First, if you see an essay question and some keywords jump out at you, if you're a first-year LLB student writing a public law essay, you might see the words rule of law, separation of powers, right? If you decide, well, I will throw everything I know about the rule of law at the examiner in the hope that something will stick, you probably have not provided an argument, right? An essay is not just a test of all that you know about the topic. You have to drive towards answering the precise question. I'll come back to it. The second way in which you know you have presented an argument or not is ask yourself, is it possible to disagree with the claims I have made in the essay? If it's not possible to disagree with you, you probably have not presented an argument. Right? So an essay is not a textbook chapter. An essay is more like a journal article. Right? It's driving towards something that's probably controversial, or at least something that it is possible to disagree with. And it gets you there through an argument. So that is the most important point about an essay. It has to be an argument. You're welcome to stop me at any point and ask clarificatory questions if anything is unclear. So don't think that you have to wait until the end to check. Is this point clear? This is the most important thing. If you don't do this, and even if you tell the examiner everything you know about the topic and present the best textbook chapter, you're at best looking at a mark in the 50s, because you've not, if you're lucky, right? You're not answering the question if you're writing a textbook chapter. So what is an argument? In order to get to an argument, so does anyone know the structure of an argument? You know that arguments have premises driving towards a conclusion? Yeah? You're nodding in the room. So most of your time in law school is about learning the structure of arguments and to tell what is a good argument, what is a bad argument, what's an invalid argument, etc. Right? So, in order to figure out your argument before you start writing your essay, or before you start typing your essay, you have to work out your argument map. And this is something you need to do. I'll tell you in a moment how to do an argument map. I mean, the format does not matter, right? But that you have to figure out your argument map or your plan for your essay. That is extremely important. And you should do that before you started writing. You should do that even in an exam. In fact, I would even say that you must do this especially in an exam. In an exam, you will have what, an hour for each essay. So it's 3 hours, 3 essays typically, 1 hour per essay. Spend about 10 to 15 minutes doing this. Once this is done, the writing part is the easy bit. If you have mapped your essay well, the writing will be a breeze. Right? This is where all the intellectual labor should already happen. The essay is just expanding it and explaining it to the reader. So, by the way, before I come to the argument map, I should also tell you something about timekeeping. Right? So there are many reasons why extremely good students end up doing badly in exams. Right? One is that they don't provide an argument, they provide a textbook chapter. That's one reason to do badly. The second reason to do badly is bad timekeeping. Right? A perfect first answer and an unfinished second and third answer is a lot worse than 3 good enough answers. Right? So, and because the best students also tend to be perfectionists, they keep hammering at that first essay. And by the time they look at their watches, an hour and 3/4 has already gone. And suddenly you realize, shit, I have only, sorry, excuse my French, an hour and 15 minutes for 2 remaining essays, and you rush it through. Bad idea, right? Good timekeeping is extremely important. So when you're practicing and revising, set yourself a timer. Do exam conditions. Don't sit for 3 hours. Don't tire yourself out, right? But close to an exam, do a 1 hour timed essay under exam conditions. Just train yourself to write fast. An exam essay under exam conditions is always a compromise. Many of the exam questions can be PhD dissertation topics. You could spend 4 years doing it, right? So you will not write the perfect essay. You cannot, nobody can. It is a compromise. And you need to do good timekeeping to get there. Okay, so what is, coming back to an argument map, what does it mean? So what's more important is the ingredient rather than the formatting of your argument map, right? The first thing you need to do is figure out your hypothesis. Do you know what a hypothesis is? Yeah? It is your answer, your one sentence answer to the essay question. So if I ask you, what have you argued in your essay? And your answer begins with, my essay is about, you're already on the wrong track, right? Because when you say my essay is about the rule of law, blah, 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 you haven't done an argumentation, right? A one sentence answer to your essay will be something like, depending on the question, in this essay, I have argued that. It is unhelpful to distinguish between the formal and the substantive conceptions of the rule of law. Full stop. And then because the reasons follow later. And I'll tell you about that right now, right? But that is an answer. It's a one sentence answer. And if the essay has multiple parts, and I'll explain to you how essays have multiple parts many times, then every part must have a separate one sentence answer to it, in general, right? You have to figure this out initially. Now, this is your gut instinct. This is your, when you look at the essay, this is your first reaction to it. This is your instinctive, this is what I think about it, right? Put that down on paper. That should be the conclusion of the argument map that you will draw up. That is what you're driving at, right? But it is the hypothesis, the conclusion is something you keep coming back to. As your argument map develops, as you put flesh on your plan for the essay, you may wish to revisit your hypothesis. You might want to tweak it. You might want to qualify it. Instead of saying it is unhelpful, maybe you realize after you've done your argument map that the distinction between formal and substantive conceptions of the rule of law is unhelpful for adjudication, but quite useful for intellectual understanding of what's going on, or whatever, right? I'm just throwing ideas at you. You may even change your mind after doing your argument map, and I'll show you why that might happen, right? You might actually decide that your hypothesis is actually completely the opposite of what your gut instinct was, right? So this is an iterative process. You keep having a conversation between your hypothesis and your arguments. And all of this work is happening before you have started writing your essay. You start with that. Then you list all your arguments in support of each hypothesis. This should be fairly straightforward. But while you're mapping your essay, it's extremely important. And also think about multiple arguments, right? Don't just try to present a single argument. And then against each argument, list all the relevant evidence. And we'll talk about what is the right form of, what is the kind of evidence that you need, right? Case law, statutes, journal articles, book chapters, whatever supports or goes against your argument, list it against that argument. So that when you're writing your essay, you have access to all the evidence base, all your material, and list the arguments on the other side, the objections to your arguments. And sometimes the objections to your arguments, the arguments against your arguments, may not be in your reading material, right? In which case, think about what would a good, strong argument on the other side be. What would somebody who disagrees with me say about this? So you might have to construct an opponent if it's not in the readings. But typically, for most questions, you would be engaging in a debate that you've already encountered. And then you have to list your responses to each objection, each opposing argument, and all the opposing evidence. If you're making a claim and you have 5 cases that support your claim, but 3 cases that go against your claim, you need to have an account of those 3 cases that go against your claim. You need to either say something like how the court got it wrong in those 3 cases, or why the dominant interpretation of those 3 cases is wrong, or although those 3 cases look like they are against your argument, but actually once we think further and for these reasons, they actually support my argument. Or I might need to tweak my argument to explain those 3 cases. Right? But don't ignore the opposition. A good essay, a first-class essay, always takes the evidence and the arguments on the other side seriously. Okay, so you have your argument map. And as I said, at each stage, you will keep revisiting your hypotheses, right? And then firm up your actual claim in the essay. Once you have all of this fully worked out, then as I said, writing the essay is a breeze, right? But what's to think about when you're actually writing your essay? So let's come to the ingredients of a good essay. And I always look for these 5 things in an essay. I'll tell you quickly what each of them mean. The very first thing you must really do, and I've already told you this, is attend to the precise question asked. So I already told you one of the biggest mistakes you can make is to talk about a topic rather than answer the question. The question is not a topic. So the question in the essays I circulated was, is the divide between the formal and substantive conceptions of the rule of law helpful or misleading? Right? That is not the same question as tell me all you need to know, all you know about the rule of law. You'll almost never be asked a question like the second one. That's a topic. Rule of law is a topic. It's not a question. That's the first mistake that you must avoid. The second mistake to avoid is producing a pre-prepared essay. Every essay is unique. Even a tiny change of word or emphasis can make it a completely different question. So, the question you read about is the divide between formal and substantive conceptions of the rule of law helpful or misleading is a different question from should the rule of law be understood as a formal or a substantive requirement? Take a moment to think about these 2 questions. Can you see why they're different questions? Why they're asking you different things, and if you produce the same essay for both of them, one of them would have missed the question. The second question is asking you which conception we should adopt, which is a better conception of the rule of law, right? Whereas the first one is asking whether the distinction is useful. Now, of course, the question is ambiguous because it does not tell you helpful or misleading for what, to whom. To scholars and students, or to judges and practitioners. Maybe there are different answers to those categories, right? But that's exactly the difference. The first question is not inviting you to ask whether you prefer the formal or the substantive conception, right? And why does this mistake happen? This mistake is, again, mainly a mistake that good students make because you practice, you revise, you do practice essays, formative essays, and you do really well in it, right? You get a very high mark in your formative essay on the rule of law, and then you fall in love with it. You think, I have nailed the rule of law essay, right? And then you regurgitate the same essay in the exam, but the question was different. Right? So it's really important to know that you have to work out your essay in the exam room. Pre-prepared essays are not going to be useful. Okay, answer the precise question asked. And I've already explained some of this, but attend to every part of the question. This is another reason why students sometimes lose a grade or two. So think of this question. Discuss the position of the House of Lords in the UK Constitution and assess the options for reform. Although this is asked in one sentence, this is in fact two different questions. One invites you to discuss the position of the House of Lords in the UK Constitution. What position does it occupy? Obviously, undergrad students will know that you have to discuss its unelected character, Parliament Act 1911, 1949, the Jackson case, in maybe the Salisbury Convention, the appointment powers of the Prime Minister for peers, etc., right? And then assess the options for reform is a distinct part of the question. What are the proposals that have been made for reforming it? How could it be improved? What needs to change, right? And you have to answer both parts separately. And finally, think about the nature of the question. Is the question discursive, descriptive, or normative? Right? Now, don't spend a huge amount of time doing this, right? These are just guidelines. Classifying the questions, setting labels is generally helpful because it helps you think about the kind of answer that's expected of you. But don't end up spending half an hour figuring out whether it's normative or descriptive. Some questions may not be clear-cut, right? But here are some examples. So what's a discursive question? A discursive question will have a claim in quotes, and it'll say discuss, right? So here, the quotation is, courts now treat prerogative the same as any other species of executive power. Discuss, right? Now, what is expected of you in a discursive question? The first thing to know about a discursive question is, does the examiner expect you, can the examiner expect you to know where the quotation is from? So sometimes the examiner would tell you where the quotation is from. There'll be a reference, either a case reference or an article reference, an author reference, or whatever, right? Sometimes they wouldn't, so they haven't done so here, right? Now, if you think that the examiner can reasonably expect of you where the quotation is from, so especially if the citation is mentioned, if the reference is mentioned, if it says which case or which author, right? It's usually a good idea to attempt the question only if you know about the source. If you know what actually happened in that case, or if you have read that piece from which the quotation is from. You don't have to recall precisely sort of, chapter and verse, which paragraph or which page the author said it. But if you, just to make sure that you haven't misinterpreted the claim. So knowing the case that the examiner has mentioned will let you see whether the quotation is out of context or not, whether it's against the grain of what happened in the case, or whether it captures the central claim in the case, the ratio of the case, for example, right? But a generic quotation like this one, it's not referenced in, it's not something that you really need to know who said it in order to answer it, right? And it may not even be a real quotation. It may be something the examiner made up and put it in quotes, right? So it's a judgment about your knowledge of the course. But anyway, that's just a security check so that you don't misread the quote. And then you have to engage with the quote. So a quote will usually be something provocative. Well, okay, at least if you're a constitutional lawyer, this is provocative, probably not to anybody else in the whole world. But anyway, right? So a quotation like this is inviting you to ask whether courts really treat prerogative powers in the same way as other species of executive power, Which is the main other species of executive power? Delegated powers. Right? Powers that Parliament delegates. You can dig down further, right? Delegated executive power, delegated legislative powers, and actual executive powers, right? So powers of legislation, rulemaking powers, etc. So there are many categories of what the executive does, right? And the more sophisticated essay will check against each category, right? A more generic essay will only think about prerogative and executive powers generally, right? But you have to engage with the claim, and you have to say whether you agree that courts treat prerogative power the same as the executive power or not, and if you disagree, what are the differences? How do courts treat prerogative power differently? Right? So a case like Bonku will be quite important. If you're really confused about it, don't worry, because you haven't done prerogative powers yet. So I'm looking at first year cases and looking very troubled and shocked about like how will I answer this question. Don't be shocked. You have not covered this topic yet. Right? This is just an example of something that you will know later, right? So that's a discursive essay. Normative is easier, so I'll tell you that first, right? So is judicial discretion undesirable? Can it be eliminated? So normative question is one that requires value judgment. It's a should question. Should we do something? Should something in the world change? Should it remain the same? Should we preserve it? But should questions can be asked without using the word should. Right? So is judicial discretion undesirable? Is a normative question, because the word undesirable requires value judgment, even though it's framed with an is in front. Can you see that? Is it clear to everyone? Any difficulty in seeing that? The second part of the question is not normative. The second part is descriptive. Can it be eliminated? That does not require you to make a value judgment. It just requires you to make a descriptive judgment about whether judicial review can be, judicial discretion can be eliminated. Okay? So you see the difference between normative and descriptive questions. As I said, these are broad guidelines. Sometimes the distinction will not be clear. Don't end up spending a huge amount of time trying to figure out how to classify them. But knowing what the question is asking you helps you frame your hypothesis. If you know it's a normative question, the hypothesis will be an answer to a should question. If you know it's a descriptive question, the hypothesis will be an answer to an is question. Okay? And is everything clear on this first ingredient of how to attend to the precise question asked? This is the most important thing. If you get this wrong fundamentally, you have lost at least one grade, if not two, and you can possibly completely bomb the essay, right? So getting this right is the most important thing to do. Any questions on this? Okay. So the second thing is structure, and this is where the kindness comes in. Kindness to the tired examiner. Right. So you must have a very clear statement of your hypotheses, of your theses, in the very first paragraph of your essay. Right. So what you're not doing, an essay is not a detective novel. Right. I don't want a ta-da moment at the end. You're not trying to keep me curious and keen, right? Show the examiner your destination as soon as you start. Tell them where you will take them. And as soon as you've done that, show them your map. Show them the route you will take to that destination. So this is where in the very first paragraph you write out your argument map. Not with all the evidence and the objections and counter-objections and responses to objections. All of that is for the body of the essay. But the broad contours of your destination, there should be a house on this map at the end, right, which the examiner should be able to see, and how you will go there, right, and the different paths you will take to go. All of that should be there up front. No surprises. There are other things that you might want to put in your introduction. So sometimes an essay might require an interpretation. Sometimes an essay is too broad to answer in an hour. You might need to narrow its scope. Or sometimes, like that question about is the distinction desirable or undesirable, right? You might need to say this question can be thought of in terms of desirability for adjudication and desirability for scholarship. I'm going to answer this question in relation to adjudication. That's an interpretation of a question, right? I will do that in the interest of time and space and because the question is more interesting under this interpretation, right? So that is all legitimate. You can interpret the question to make it narrower with one caveat. Don't interpret away the difficulty. If you give the question an interpretation that makes it too easy to answer, it makes it not worth asking or answering, that's kind of cheating. Don't do that, right? So give an interpretation that leaves it as an interesting question and your answer to it can be disagreed with. If you give it an interpretation that makes it so obvious, so clear, that nobody can disagree with what you've argued, you may be right, but you've interpreted the difficulty away and you will be marked down for it. Okay. Then a good structure will actually follow the path that you've laid out instead of doing something else. Right? And the conclusion should naturally follow from your arguments, right? If you've done your argument map well, this will happen naturally, right? But the paths that you have taken should actually reach the destination you want to get to. So sometimes a mistake that students make is, especially a distracted student who started well, right? Who has not done an argument map, who looks at the question and writes a beautiful introduction saying what they will argue, etc., right? And then by the time it comes to the body, they've become distracted, they've forgotten what the question is, they started talking about all sorts of things, right? About the topic, right? And then suddenly they're running out of time, they come to the conclusion and they realize that they need to finish the essay, so they look at the question again and say, in conclusion, it can be said that, and then they go back to the hypothesis, right? So it's a pulling the rabbit out of the hat trick. Why? Because the body of the essay does not actually merit that conclusion. So your conclusion to the essay should basically flow naturally. If you forget to write it or if you run out of time to write it, the examiner should be able to supply that conclusion for you. It should be so plain after your essay is actually done. And it's okay to reach a conclusion that's different from your original hypothesis. You can say, okay, I started out differently. I started out to prove X, but actually, in light of this discussion, the real answer is X dash, or even Y, or that X is actually false, right? Now, in a formative, you don't need to do that because you have the time to work out everything and you've done your essay planning and you can change things, right? This is mainly for exams where you may not have the time. Despite all your planning, your brain keeps working as you're writing the essay and you see new arguments, new objections, which require you to change your initial hypothesis, right? So in the conclusion, you can just reach a different hypothesis as long as you tell the examiner you've reached a different hypothesis without having to go back to edit your original hypothesis, because in an exam, you're always attending to the balance of time and effort, right? And every time you spent on one essay is time taken away from another. So it's much better to just tell the examiner, look, I started out trying to prove X. What I've actually ended up doing is disproving X for the reasons you've seen, right? As long as the conclusion is merited, that's okay. Right? If you have the time, by all means, change your hypothesis. But this is just a tip about what to prioritize. Okay, third thing, knowledge. So, are there gaps or errors in your knowledge of material? If you don't know the topic well, don't answer it. An examiner can expect you to know everything that's on your reading list. And not just the essential readings, also the optional readings. You must know the primary material, which includes case law and statutes, committee reports. There may be other primary material, which is not obvious. Don't just focus on cases. There may be other things that are relevant. And also secondary material. journal articles, chapters in edited collections, monographs. Monographs are argumentative books, like Nick Barber's book that you've been reading, but not textbooks. You don't cite textbooks. Why? Because textbooks are compendium of material from others, material from case law, material from what other people have said. So instead of citing a textbook, go back to the material that the textbook itself is cited and cite that. Instead of saying that Merkins and Lussier say this, say what the actual case says, which they have used to say what they have said. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Does this also count for formatives?
Sorry?
Does this also count for formatives?
Yeah. Yeah. And don't fret over referencing style. Far too many students ask me what style to use. That does not make any difference. As long as you're clear and consistent, as long as the examiner can know, and you don't have to be super detailed in the formative, sure, you can put page numbers and paragraphs if you want. In an exam, nobody will expect you to remember the precise page number where it comes from. If you broadly can tell the examiner, look, I know the case, or I know this article, and just even in brackets, Barber, whatever, right? That's enough. In the formative, if you want, you can do more, but don't fret over it. That's not what you're being marked for. But you do need to reference. Something you have borrowed, you have to reference it. Okay, extremely important. The material has to be relevant. And this is also a skill that the examiner is testing. Not just whether you know everything about the topic, but do you have the judgment to tell which part of the material on the topic is useful for this essay and which part is not, right? So exercise that judgment. Ask yourself. And also, is there relevant material from other topics? Can you see connections? Although this question sounds like a rule of law question, have I read something in the week on parliamentary supremacy or on separation of powers or on conventions that actually I can use to inform this essay, which is relevant, right? So both knowing what's not relevant and knowing what's relevant but not obviously relevant, they're both important skills. And obviously knowing how the relevant material fits together. Now remember, relevant material is not just material that helps your point. It is also material that goes against your point, right? So material on both sides, and I'll come back to this point in a moment. Okay, so the fourth thing is analysis. What does this mean? I've already talked about whether the argument in fact leads to the conclusion. Extremely important. This is also important. Is there a single line of argument or interconnected multiple sophisticated arguments? So the two essays that were circulated to you, if you've seen them, you will see that they're both very good essays on the topic, right? But essay number 1 used 2 lines of arguments to get to the conclusion of that essay. Essay number 2 only used 1 line of argument, right? As an examiner, of course, you will mark essay number 1 higher than essay number 2, right? And it will be a difference of a grade. Essay number 1 in that will probably be marked, and I would mark it maybe 70, 71. Essay number 2 would be 67, 68, something like that. So good essays, but a difference of a grade because of the sophistication of lines of argument. But you have to be careful that the multiple arguments are mutually coherent. If you end up using incoherent argument, you've ended up arguing against yourself, right? Without resolving the difficulty. And by the way, this also means, okay, this is a problem that many students face, which is what is expected of you is an argument and a position, right? And sometimes you can feel overwhelmed by it because you see good arguments on both sides. And many good students will end up saying in the conclusion, on the one hand, X, on the other hand, Y, and then you throw your hands up and say, this is too hard, I can't decide, right? Now, sadly, that is not rewarded. You have to make up your mind. You can't sit on the fence. You can come to a compromise solution. You might find that the truth is somewhere in between the two positions. That's okay, but you have to have a position. You can't just say this is too hard. So basically, that judge in the Spelunkian Explorers case who said this is too hard, I'm not deciding, you can't do that. Not as a judge, not as a student, right? The examiner knows it is hard, which is why they have asked a question. Oh, also, by the way, that reminds me, don't praise the examiner. There's no point in flowery introductions that say this is a really important question and, impliedly, well done for asking it, etc. Right? Don't waste your time in theirs, right? I know that many of you in school have learned about, starting with sort of the importance of the question, the importance of the problem or whatever. You don't have the time to do that. Jump straight into your answer. Okay? This is really important. Well, not just Marge Simpson, but also whether you've engaged the opposition. You have to address arguments and evidence on the other side. Without doing that, you will lose at least one grade, if not two. So you have to engage with their strongest version, not their weakest. Don't beat strawmen. You're not trying to convince me to join your political party. You're trying to show me how your brain works and whether you have really figured out the answer for yourself. Right? So don't, it's a form of cheating if you mischaracterize the argument on the other side just to make your job of dismissing it easier. Use the best version of their argument, the strongest version. Have a response. Tell us why you think that argument is wrong. And if it is right, modify your own position. Right? So scholarship is not about being tribal. You have to have intellectual humility, intellectual flexibility to think for yourself, which includes the ability to change your mind. And finally, I look for originality. But originality does not just mean an original conclusion. Originality may be an original interpretation to the question, an original way to think about the debate, an original argument, an original method, an original use of material from a different topic for this question. There are many ways of being original, but don't force it. There's a thin line between originality and outlandishness. So I don't know what you think of this cake, but I think it's horrid, right? So don't bake a cake like this. I mean, you can overdo it. So don't force it. If you have done your mapping properly, and if you have done all the other things that I've told you about well, right? If you've attended to the question carefully, if you've written a good structure, if you know your material for and against, if you have a sound analysis, chances are that originality will follow. Right? It's a thin dividing line. Bear it in mind, but don't force it. Okay, so that's broadly what I want to tell you. Do you have any questions on essay writing? Well, one final thing, I'll take your question in a moment, Mara, actually, on preparing and revising and training for essay writing, besides the formative, the best way you can do this is to form a writing group with some friends. Not a huge group. I think anything between 3 and 5 is ideal. People you trust, people who you know to be kind, because when you know that your friends will be kind, it'll be easier for them to give you honest and robust feedback. Right? The worst thing in such a group would be when you're holding back criticism. Criticism in this context is service. You want you want a friendship, a relationship of the sort that allows you to be critical honestly, robustly, without obviously damaging, right? So if you, I mean, sometimes you just end up praising each other's work and then there's no opportunity to learn, right? But don't be a free rider, return the favor, and it's not just getting comments on your own essay, but commenting on other essays on the basis of these criteria is one of the best ways of learning to write a good essay. The more you think about these features in somebody else's essays, because it's much harder to see them in your own work, but when you can think about them in other people's work, you will think about them better in your own essays, right? So that's just a tip about how to prepare, how to revise. Yes, ma'am.